Vous avez évoqué Dickens pour la construction. Vous pouvez préciser ce parallèle?
Well, Dickens was the master at taking a large ensemble cast of characters and having their actions affect one another over large narrative distances, so that a character way over here does something and 10 characters away, it affects it over here. He was a master at building the web-like plot. When I wrote the first book, I set for myself a kind of challenge, which was to write on a big canvas. That's what I wanted to do. Lots of characters, lots of time, lots of geography, world building, just the whole package. For the second book, having done those things, what I wanted to do is I wanted to write a story that had that kind of plot structure, because it's enormously satisfying when it all comes together in the end. I wanted to have all these plot strands be operating and have the reader both fascinated and a little anxious about how these things would all come together, and then somehow get everybody and every plot together in the same room at the same moment at the end of the story. Because I think that's just it's a very satisfying literary effect. And that was kind of what I laid in front of me. And Dickens was, I was educated in lots of different, writers and lots of different national literatures. But Dickens was, I studied him for plot. But there are a number of writers that were very influential on this book. And there's all my books contain lots of homages, winks at, and some, to other writers and other books. Some of them quite overt. They're sitting out in the open because, Tale of Two Cities is mentioned early in the 12. A character is reading it, and ultimately the 12 is a tale of two cities, a community in Texas and a community in Iowa. Some of them are little Easter eggs buried in the grass, little presents for readers who want to notice it. And some of them are dramatized in ways that I hope readers realize. In the 12, there's a whole chapter that is a long homage to probably the most unlikely source for a post-apocalyptic vampire novel, and it is Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, which was a very important book for me in college as I was learning to write, because of the way she learned to control point of view and to kind of put a human mind on the page. And so there's a chapter, and I challenge readers to go identify it. It's pretty easy once you know it's there, right? To go find it.
Là, beaucoup de passages du livre sont presque des nouvelles indépendantes. Est-ce que vous les écrivez en les concevant immédiatement dans l'ensemble, ou est-ce que vous faites après une espèce de juxtaposition de tout ce matériel?
I've heard that some writers do this. I've heard that some of them will write a character thread or one plot line in a multi-plotted book, and then they'll write the next one, then they'll write the next one, and then they'll sit on the floor with a pair of scissors and, decide the order in which they'll be told. I'm not one of those people. I tend to write from beginning to end, straight through. The reason I do this is because I can. When I plan a book in advance, I don't really have to think in these terms, and I like the variety. Like one day I'll be writing about one character, and the next day I'll be writing about another character. It kind of keeps me engaged. And so I don't have to do it differently, but I also like to feel the book's rhythms.
Cette idée d'une trilogie a été dans la conception dès le départ, et pourquoi cette division en trois?
I planned this as a trilogy from the outset, or at least very early in the process when I was planning the first book. And some of that was just practical, because I realized I had this enormous story with a huge cast of characters. I wanted to indulge my taste in secondary characters. I wanted there to be no secondary characters. I wanted everybody to be important and to have a complete knowledge of them and to tell a rather complete story for each of my major characters. I realized this was going to take some space. I realized also that the book was going to make use of 1,000 years of time, which did not sound to me like a short book or books. And so I planned it as 3. The shape of 3 is just a natural storytelling shape. It's beginning, middle, end. So, and I know when I thought about it, I said, okay, I'm going to break it into 3. How would that operate? And it fit very well into that.
Et tout est déjà construit, ou est-ce que entre le projet de départ et ce que sont les 2 premiers, ce que sera le 3e, il y a des choses qui évoluent beaucoup?
I'm very much a planner as a writer. My feeling about writing a novel is that you really do need to plan it in advance if it's going to be a good, strong book, because the ending of the book needs to be contained in its beginning. I mean, your authority as a writer and as a narrator of a story comes from the fact that you know what it is about. And for that to be true, you need to know the whole thing. So I plan these novels in advance. I had a detailed plan of the first book, and then when I started the whole thing, I had a detailed plan for the first book, and then a substantially less detailed but nevertheless coherent plan for books 2 and 3. The one thing that I've always known is how the third book ends.
Le vampire est une figure de plus en plus importante aujourd'hui dans la littérature, surtout fantastique. Qu'est-ce qu'il incarne, à votre avis, par rapport à notre époque?
The vampire monster is one of really 4 monsters that we have. Everything's a version of one of 4. They are the werewolf, the zombie, the Frankenstein monster, and the vampire. That's pretty much it. You can also add ghosts to that, but that's not really a monster, right? And of these 4, they're all actually in currency at any given moment. They just take different forms, and we notice them more than others. The vampire story is, I think, the richest one, speaking as a writer. And by rich, I mean it's got the most detail. It's got the most material. I don't know if you all watch The Walking Dead in France. It's this enormously successful show in the States, and I love it. And I like zombies. But the problem with zombies is there's only so much you can do with dead people, right? There is a couple of metaphors that radiate out. I don't know if you've noticed this, but zombies are pretty much always dressed for work. Right, they're always dressed. There's the suggestion is the sort of dullness of consumer life and the repetitive, life that we live, where we go to our jobs every day, and there's only so much you can do with it. The other thing that happens in every zombie story is that sooner or later people notice that zombies are dead, and as a consequence, killing them becomes not just useful, but sort of pleasurable. I mean, there's always a scene in which it becomes slapstick, right? And I enjoy the genre, but there's not much to it. The werewolf story, men are dogs. We know this. There's only so much you can say about that, and it's pretty obvious. The Frankenstein story, it's sort of over. I mean, my iPhone has become Frankenstein. We all live we swim in these technologies now, and we're very, very dependent upon them. So our sense of distrust seems to have been exhausted. The vampire story is full of detail. That's the thing I like about it. It's got all these wonderful things, sleeping in the native soil and putting a stake through the heart and being afraid of crosses and not liking garlic and the shape-shifting and the whole sexual tone of the whole thing. It's a great story. And really our original vampire story in the Judeo-Christian tradition, to my way of thinking, is the story of the temptation in the Garden of Eden. It's got all the material. It's got the fanged creature. It's got the seduction of a girl. It's got questions of mortality. Do you want to be a god? Do you want to be human? We go back to this story again and again and again, and we retread it. We disguise it. We turn it into other things. And it's something that it's a story that is tremendously plastic. It's very flexible. You can take it and solder it onto another story very easily and produce terrific narratives that express current cultural anxieties. Right. The current vampire craze, I think, is really just an instance where there's a few very successful books, and we know what they are, right? It's never gone away. I mean, I grew up on my vampire stories. I'm sure you did as well. I always say that on Halloween, at some point, there'll be a knock on the door and you'll look down and you'll see a little 6-year-old vampire. It's one of the stories that everybody gets a hold of very, very early.
Littérairement, lesquels vous ont séduit, vous situez où entre Bram Stoker et Twilight?
Well, I've never read Twilight.
No.
Okay, Twilight was written for young women, and I'm not a woman, and I'm not young, so it was for an entirely different demographic. I also drove a carpool of 7th grade girls, so I know everything I need to know about it. The original Bram Stoker, of course, would be a closer antecedent, but the inspirations for the book came from other rather more unlikely sources. Some of them gothic, horror, science fiction, some of them not. I mean, for every book I write, I always feel like there's one book that's over my shoulder. There's one that's kind of looking over my shoulder and kind of drew me to this story and is helping me organize it and think about it. The book that did that for The Passage was not a vampire story. It was not an apocalyptic story. It was a Western. A novel called Lonesome Dove by the writer Larry McMurtry. I don't know if French readers are familiar with this masterpiece. It is a fantastic novel. And when I was thinking about The Passage, one of the things that occurred to me and became important was the notion that the characters in the story who have been living in isolation 100 years in a post-industrial, post-apocalyptic future are going to leave the confines of their place where they know all the rules and where everybody's related to everybody else and they have a very, clear and specific system of going about their lives, leaving those confines and then traveling across the West. They were going to be encountering the large, immense, beautiful, frightening, dangerous Western American landscape, very much like the first European settlers. And so it's both a Western and it's what we would call a road novel. It's a book about travel. And Lonesome Dove is really a kind of masterpiece of that form that I read for the first time in the mid-'80s. And I hadn't read a Western for years. And I realized then how a book that can be easily grouped into a genre. It can be very easily grouped into a genre. It has every piece that you'd expect in a Western. It's got the praying women and the fighting men and the Indians and the cattle drive and all of that, and the whiskey and the prostitutes. It's got everything. And it's also magnificently written. It's a masterpiece. It won the Pulitzer Prize. And those are the stories that I really like. I love a great story that also has great writing.
Il y a une adaptation audiovisuelle en cours. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous en dire plus? Est-ce que c'est télé, cinéma? Et vous, comment est-ce que vous le verriez?
I don't really know the status of the film and television projects that might be associated with it at this point. It was indeed bought by Fox a number of years ago when I was writing the first book. They loved the idea. They liked what they had seen in the book. Hollywood moves differently from the writing of novels, as I've learned, because to write a novel, all I have to do is pour myself a cup of coffee and go up to my office and just work all day. Whereas to make a movie, you need, to get a lot of people together in a room. You need a lot of money. You need a tax break in New Zealand. You need to have the whole thing catered. You need to have stars who will fit the schedule and screenwriters who will fit the schedule. And you have to have a lot of very difficult and eccentric people cooperate. I'm glad I'm not in the movie business. My feeling overall is that the trilogy would the best adaptation for it would be sort of miniseries HBO television, and the reason for that is, well, I think people have noticed this. The movie, film is very much a kind of has become the property of the special effects people, right? Which is fine, but it goes only so far as it can, and I find myself increasingly looking to well-made television for good storytelling, and a lot of writers, novelists, some that I know are now getting involved in television because since the late 90s with a show called The Sopranos, which I'm sure you have here, The Sopranos suddenly made television great because The Sopranos was Dostoevsky in New Jersey. And real writers of fiction, writers of novels began to move into television, and they are now where that material is all coming from. It's become a writer's medium. And you can engage with it over a long period of time the way you would with a novel. And of course, Dickens was the serial television of his day, right? Everybody, in American audiences where everybody's waiting on the dock for the next chapter, right? And so there's a solid precedent for this. So I'm kind of hoping that they go in the direction of television. I'd like to keep all the characters. I'd like to keep the story intact. And maybe that's just ego, but nevertheless, that's how I imagine the material.
Ok, merci.
You're very welcome.